Okay, let's continue with the brain, chapter 12. Pick up where we left off. This will be 203, brain 2. So talking more about parts of the brain and what they do, and about central white matter. Remember, white matter are myelinated axons in the central nervous system, and remember, well, a bundle of myelinated axons, remember, in the peripheral nervous system is a nerve. In the central nervous system is called a tract. So we have three types of tracts. It all depends on where they go. This is on page 507. Association tracts go from one part of the cerebral cortex to another part of the cerebral cortex in the same hemisphere. So this is going from like the primary areas, from like the primary sensory areas for vision, or you get this image in your brain, and then that image goes along project association tracts to the association areas, and then associate what then you recognize what you're looking at. Then it's commissural tracts. They go through the corpus callosum and the fornix. That allows the two hemispheres to talk to each other. And then finally, projection tracts are either inferiorly projecting tracts or superiorly projecting tracts. That is, areas of the cerebral cortex communicating with lower areas in the brain, or lower areas of the brain communicating with the cerebral cortex. Those would be projection tracts. And we've already seen this cerebral lateralization, safe asymmetries, which is not too important. Fatality is one lobe is a little bit farther ahead than the other lobe. The more interesting thing is the functional symmetries. As we mentioned before, the left hemisphere, and this is for you, this is for most people. This is not actually a hard and fact 100% thing. Left is categorical, and for logic and reasoning and mathematical ability and everything. And right is representation that of art and spatial recognition, and everything is a representation. And you could generally tell, you can talk about left brain people and right people. Left brain people usually go into sciences and math, or right brain people usually go into the arts and humanities and things like this. Okay, gender differences. Cerebral lateralization, the functional part, is more pronounced in males than it is in females. Females have a thicker corpus callosum. Their hemispheres talk to each other more than the hemispheres do in males. So there are more commissural tracts. And this has consequences. Females make connections between things that males actually can't see and have to be told about. They're great at making connections. There was a book, Women Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Also, there's one with a religious band called Men Are Like Waffles, Women Are Like Spaghetti. And that is, when a man tries to figure out a problem, one hemisphere lights up. If it's an art and representational problem, it's right. If it's a math problem or science problem, it's left. And they can see this by using radioactive glucose. And injecting radioactive glucose in somebody, put them in an MRI, tell them to do something of a problem and see where that glucose is being used, where what it actually lights up. However, if you give a woman a problem and you put it in an MRI, both hemispheres light up for any kind of a problem. So women are using both hemispheres to figure stuff out. Men, they only use one. And that's a real difference. And so women can see these connections between things, spaghetti, while men are more compartmentalized, waffles. There's a space here, I got a space here for this, a space here for this. And there's not a lot of connections between those. Okay. And there is, should be on the next page. On page 508, here are the patalias are on the left here. Your right frontal lobe is a little farther ahead than the left frontal lobe, and the left occipital lobe is a little slightly farther back than the right. That's kind of minor differences. Here, left hemisphere is categorical, verbal memory, speech, motor speech, focus area. Right hand motor control, feeling shapes with right hand. Superior language and mathematical comprehension. When this is Wernicke's area for speech comprehension. The right visual field. Actually, when we get into the senses, we'll find that eyesight hemidesiccates. The image is from both eyes go to both hemispheres. Right hemisphere representation, memory for shapes. Left hand motor coordination, musical ability, recognition of faces and spatial relationships. And then the left visual field, but also right. Okay. So that's the physical and functional cerebral lateralizations. Well, there are the projection tracks right there. I mean the tracks. So these are association tracks in red up here going from one area of the cerebral cortex to another. Then the blue is the common cerebral tracts where two hemispheres talk to each other. And finally, the green are the projection tracts, either one's projecting inferiorly or superiorly. And notice how they decussate. If they go down into the spinal cord, or as far as the medulla oblongata, they're going to decussate in the medulla oblongata or decussate later on in the spinal cord. Most projection tracts. Okay, cerebral nuclei are sometimes used to be called they're also called the basal nuclei. It used to be called the basal ganglia, but that's not proper because remember they are a collection of cell bodies. So they're great. So they're gray matter, and collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called nucleus, not a ganglia. That's peripheral. So it's a cerebral nuclei or basal nuclei, and there's different nuclei that do different things. Like the caudate nucleus mostly helps coordinate walking. These are mostly to do with motor control. As I mentioned before, a large part of your brain is devoted to coordinate motor control. It's a very difficult thing. It looks so simple when you're doing stuff, but it's very complicated. Then there's the amygdala nucleus, amygdala emotions. This is something we'll talk about later on also when we get into the limbic system. So we're talking about, when I'm talking about the cerebral cortex, we're talking about deep within the cerebrum are these cerebral nuclei. And that's also what the limbic system is. And that's really one of the oldest parts of your cerebrum. You know, the outer part of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex is a newer invention, the neocortex. These are really old parts that every mammal has these parts. Well, every mammal has a cerebral cortex also, but a lot of mammals, they're very, very simplistic. But the basal nuclei are pretty much the same, and the limbic system is pretty much the same across the board with mammals. Okay, lentiform nucleus, putamen and globus patellis. You just have to need to know these names, and that they are part of the cerebral nuclei, and they are involved in motor control, coordinated motor control. Subconscious muscular control of muscle tone. Remember what muscle tone is? Muscle tone is used, and we'll get into this in the muscle chapter later on in the semester, where there's a motor program sent out, really from the cerebellum, to send out the muscles, even when muscles are not moving, they are being stimulated in an unconscious, random way So, our muscles are not being used right now, but there are fibers in there that are being stimulated. And not enough for you to have a physical movement of the muscle, but enough to keep those fibers healthy. It's almost like a trophic relationship between muscle fibers and being stimulated by their motor neurons. It keeps them healthy and keeps them ready to fire instantly when they're needed. Right? This is called a muscle tone. This is why people with spinal cord injuries, they eventually, their muscles start to atrophy and they have loss of muscle tone. Okay, colostrum, unconscious visual processing, and corpus striatum, white matter, internal capsule. This is all part of, and what an interesting thing what the cerebral nuclei do. Well, here they all are here. So here's the cerebral cortex out here, right? And here are the cerebral nuclei here, the caudate nucleus over here, the putamen, globus pallidus, colostrum, and amygdaloid body. They're all deep within the, and they are gray matter, but they're internal gray matter, not on the outside. They're deep within the cerebrum and in the oldest part of the cerebrum. And here's what they do. It's sort of interesting. One of the major things the basal nuclei do is actually inhibition of unwanted motion. And it's really kind of odd. There's a couple, well, let's talk about Huntington's disease. It's a general disintegration of your whole brain, not just your basal nuclei. Your brain just stops functioning, you can't move anymore, and you die, and it's an autosomal dominant, which means if your parent dies, you have a 50% chance of getting that defective gene, and your brain is gonna self-destruct in your like late 40s, early 50s, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's kind of a harsh disease. Anyway, because most of these genetic diseases are recessive, and so you have to get a defective gene from both parents to be inflicted with it. But a dominant, you just need one. So anyway, Parkinson's disease, what's much more well known, loss of dopamine producing cells in the substantia nigra of the midbrain. Now, so this is an exception to the rule of being in the cerebrum. The substantia nigra, it's called that because it looks dark under section. So it's called so substantia nigra is a black substance in Latin. It's in the midbrain, different, which is the most superior part of the brainstem. So this is one part of the basal nuclei that's not in the cerebrum, and it communicates though with the basal nuclei in the cerebrum, and it helps to inhibit unwanted movement. So a person with Parkinson's disease has what's called standing tremor. That they can't stand still. They start jerking all over the place. Their muscles are moving when they don't want them to move. And this is because, as I said, the basal nuclei, one of their major functions is to inhibit muscles. That's what they do. They inhibit muscles. So the reason I can stand here and not move a muscle is because the basal nuclei are inhibiting them. There's what do you call it? How would you call that? A prep called the decerebrate cat, where they remove the cerebrum from a cat and every muscle goes rigid. So here's the thing. in muscle control. So I want to move my left arm up here and say, touch my nose. Okay, so over here on the right side of my brain, the motor cortex, that idea comes up. And so what they have to do is they have to send information to two lower areas along projection tracks. One's to the basal nuclei to say, okay, disinhibit those arm muscles because I want to use them. All right. And then also it sends information to the cerebellum, which we're going to get to in a little bit more. And a large part of cerebellum is motor control also. And that gets proprioceptive information as to where is my arm in space. It's over here. So if I want to touch my nose and my arm is down here, I have to contract muscles in a different order than if my arm was up here. You know, so your motor cortex needs to know that. And so your cerebellum will anticipate that motion, send information to the motor cortex about where the muscles are, and the basal nuclei will disinhibit the muscles that you need to do that so that the motor cortex can move my finger up to my nose if I wanted to. So it's all really complicated. So the information has to travel back and forth between the motor cortex and the basal nuclei and the cerebellum in order for you to do a simple fluid motion. So, and it's a loss of dopamine producing cells in the substantia nigra that causes Parkinson's. And so they can't keep their muscles still when they want to. Now, but when they go to reach for something, Parkinson's disease patients have no problem reaching for something and taking a drink or something. They abstain from it. Now, when we get to the cerebellum, we're going to learn that if you have a cerebellar lesion, you have what's called movement tremor. And that is your cerebellum anticipates movement and tells the motor cortex where your limit is and how much to contract the muscle and which muscles to contract and how hard to contract them to make a smooth motion or to hold an egg without breaking it. Whereas a person with a lesion in their cerebellum may reach for something and overreach for something and go back and forth and not quite get there, or hold an egg and not be able to either drop the egg or crush it because they're not holding it with the right. So but we'll get into that a little more with the cerebellum. Okay, cerebellum disorders. One's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and this is really mad cow disease for people. Every mammal has its own disease of a prion disease. These are infectious proteins, truly bizarre. It's an extremely rare disorder, but you get it from eating infected nerve tissue of an animal. And these prions, they persuade, they're misshapen, and they persuade other proteins in your brain to go misshapen, and your brain pretty much dissolves, becomes completely dysfunctional, and you die. And again, there's nothing you can do about it. So you got to be really careful about eating nerve tissue from infected animals, like a mad cow. Like I said, that's called bovine spongiform encephalitis in cattle. It's called scrapie in sheep. It's called wasting disease in deer. And deer can get, so whenever if you're out deer hunting and you kill a deer, you bring it in to one of the wildlife stations to have it tested for wasting disease, because you don't want to eat it if this thing has wasting disease. And it causes Alzheimer's. It's the buildup of this amyloid plaque protein in the brain. And you have certain genetic susceptibility to it. It generally happens in old age, but there's one form called early onset Alzheimer's when you start getting in the 50s. And remember, they link between that and sleep, which is, we mentioned that early on with the glymphatic pathway. This toxic protein is washed out of your brain through the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid flows more readily and wider flow when you're sleeping when you're awake. So there's a direct link between getting enough sleep and your risk for Alzheimer's. It's kind of unusual. Okay, let's move into the diencephalon. So we're going from the cerebellum to the diencephalon. As it says in the when the lab papers, if it says thalamus in the word, it means that's all in the diencephalon. The epithalamus is the pineal gland, which remember it has a role, melatonin has a role in how you feel over the course of the day, whether you're a night person or a morning person. Habicular nucleus is their visceral and emotional responses to odors. The thalamus, now there's a lot of thalamic nuclei, lots of stuff going on. But what I like to think of it is the Grand Central Station or the Chief of Staff. Grand Central Station for sensory information. All of your senses go through the thalamus, except for olfaction. That's the oldest sense. It doesn't go through. And one pain pathway doesn't go through. But all other senses goes through. So that's a Grand Central Station for sensory information. It all goes through the thalamus. And also, it's like the Chief of Staff. Filtering and identifying, or filtering sensory information and identifying what's important, because you get a tremendous amount of sensory information over the course of the day, and a lot of this is not important sensory information that you can really ignore, like the feel of the clothes on your body. That's not important. You can filter out all that. That comes up to the thalamus, and the thalamus says, okay, that's important. And one of the ways it determines whether something's important or not is whether it's changing. If it's a constant input, it's non-threatening, not important, we ignore it. If it's changing, then it might be something important. So, like I said, like the big guy, the supracortex is like the president, the thalamus is the chief of staff, is determining what do we need to send up to the big guy? What's really important? He doesn't have to learn about everything. And then you just get, and only some of the sensory information goes to the supracortex. And this might be a problem in autistic children. They seem to be overwhelmed by the amount of sensory information they're getting. And so they withdraw from it like all, because they're just getting too much and they don't know how to deal with it. So autism might be, this is speculation on my part, I haven't really looked into it, might be a problem in the thalamus of these children. Okay, okay, hypothalamus. Okay, so it's the area just below the thalamus. There's a lot of nuclei there. It's a master control of the autonomic nervous system. There are sympathetic and parasympathetic nuclei there that send out information, parasympathetic information along the vagus nerve, and send out information along sympathetic nerves. It's a master control of the endocrine system. Remember, this is where all the releasing hormones are secreted from, right? Releasing inhibitory hormones. Body temperature regulation, an area called the preoptic area, is your thermostat for your body. There are thermoreceptors there that determine your brain temperature, and they get information from temperature receptors all over your body as to what your body temperature is. And they can send out information along effectors to either lower your body temperature if it's too high or raise it if it's too high. Mammillary bodies are just little things right underneath the hypothalamus, and therefore forming new memories. A control of emotional behavior. So along with the amygdala, the hypothalamus has a lot to do with emotional behavior. And we'll be talking about emotional behavior later on when we get into the limbic system and how we control strong emotions. Control of food or water intake. There's a nucleus called the arcuate nucleus where your satiety center is. This is the area that tells you when you're hungry and tells you when you're full. Right? These are mostly gut-brain peptides that we'll talk more about next semester in the nutrition chapter. Water is an osmoregulatory center, and it's osmoreceptors there that determine what the water concentration and the sodium concentration of your cerebrospinal fluid is, and will make you thirsty if the water concentration is too low, or inhibit you from drinking if you're over hydrated. Then the regulation of circadian rhythms. So along with the pineal gland, the major area of taking care of circadian rhythms takes place in a suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. And we are on a circadian rhythm. We're on a 24-hour cycle, not 25, 24. It's kind of odd. So they're taking people and put them in a cave and give them all the needs of life, but don't give them any time cues as to what time it is. And they will tend to go to bed late, 1 hour later each night and get up 1 hour later the next morning. And they'll cycle through the entire 25 days like that. And you'll come full circle, always being off by an hour, because we're on a 25-hour cycle, not a 24. That's why it's called a circadian. It's circadian is close to 24, but not 24. Okay, and there are some of the areas, and you're not going to need to know all the names of these, like the ventral medial nucleus. I did mention the arcuate nucleus. I did mention the preoptic area and suprachiasmatic. There's the optic chiasma right underneath the hypothalamus. And of course, there's the infundibulum going down to the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary right next to it. Okay, the brainstem. Remember the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Okay, so right throughout the entire midbrain, something called a reticular formation. And it's a loose arrangement of neurons. Nobody knows really how these neurons are arranged. And they have a lot to do with, well, one thing is called the reticular activating system. If you, the alarm that got you up this morning, if you set your alarm, it activated the reticular formation. The reticular formation puts you to sleep, and it wakes you up when it's time to get up. There's a lot of other stuff in reticular formation also. We're talking about different nuclei that control basic homeostatic functions like respiration and like the cardiovascular system is going to be in the reticular formation also. The cerebral aqueduct goes right through the midbrain. Remember, it connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and cerebrospinal fluid flows through it. There are nuclei for cranial nerves. For cranial nerve 3, which is oculomotor, and 4, trochlear, and they control voluntary eye muscles. The exterior eye muscles are controlled by nuclei in the midbrain. In the tectum, that's the posterior part of the almost superior part, posterior and superior, where the corpora quadrigemini are located. And that's Latin for 4 bodies. 2 of the bodies are called the superior colliculi, and the 2 lower bodies are called the inferior colliculi. And the superior are for visual reflexes. So if you see something rushing at your face, you get out of the way without even thinking about it. If you hear a loud noise behind you, you'll move and get out of the way. Just automatically, it's a reflex move. So superior visual reflexes, inferior auditory reflexes. Then the tegmentum. There's the red nuclear acid to get information from the cerebellum, and cerebellum issues commands for maintaining posture. So you don't really have to think about maintaining posture. It's already taken care of you automatically, even though those are skeletal muscles and you can't control them if you want to. You don't really have to think about maintaining posture. The medial lemniscus is a fiber tract relating proprioceptive information. So remember what proprioceptive information is. That's information from muscle spindle fibers. We'll talk about those in the muscle chapter, where it tells your brain how contracted every muscle is. So you know where your body parts are in space. And that's why you can do that. Because I know where my arm is. I don't even have to watch it. I know where it is. That's proprioceptive information. And so medial lemniscus is white matter, a fiber tract, relaying this information to the cerebellum. Cerebral peduncles. These are big white matter tracts that connect the midbrain to the cerebellum and cerebellum to the midbrain and the spinal cord. The substantia nigra, we talked about that. That's in the midbrain also. That's inhibitory motor signals to stop unwanted motion, and that's the loss of those cells is it causes Parkinson's disease. Then a central gray matter right around the cerebral aqueduct. It's called central gray matter, and that's pain. That's pain information coming up from wherever into your brain. And we're going to look at pain pathways more when we get into the senses chapter. We'll talk more about pain, because pain is a sense. It's mostly called a general sense because it comes from all over the body. Okay, reticular formation. You went back to reticular formation. So there's lots of things in the reticular formation because it goes throughout the midbrain and throughout the entire brainstem. The middle of the whole brainstem is called the reticular formation. And it's got somatic motor control, cardiovascular controls, the cardiovascular centers for both heart rate and for what's called the vasomotor center that controls the contraction of the smooth muscle in your arteries and veins. And we'll talk a lot more about those areas next semester in the when we talk about the cardiovascular system. Pain modulation. There are natural analgesic pathways. So we're going to get ascending pathways that give you a sensation of pain. And then we'll talk about how they will trigger off a different pathway. That's a natural analgesic or pain relieving pathway that will go descending down through the reticular formation and actually inhibit pain farther on in your periphery. Sleep and consciousness, as is the reticular activating system that puts you to sleep at night and wakes you up in the morning. And then habituation is getting used to normal, unchanging stimuli. We'll talk about that in also more in the senses chapter, where if you get for most sensory receptors, if they are just continuously stimulated at the same level, unchanging, you will habituate to that, and you'll sort of ignore it. You won't even feel it anymore. And that information goes through the reticular formation. So there's the reticular formation right there, throughout the entire brainstem, and it has connections to cerebellum, to the cerebral cortex, and it's connected all over the place and has all those particular functions. Okay, I think we'll finish the brainstem and then we'll call this end this video. Medulla oblongata, inferior olivary nucleus, a major relay center, reticular formation control centers. As I mentioned, cardiac center controls heart rate. Vasomotor center controls the smooth muscle around blood vessels, and a respiratory center that keeps you breathing when you can be completely unconscious and asleep and you're still breathing regularly. The pons is mostly fiber tracts. Cerebellar peduncles, fiber tracts, beginning or end of cranial nerves, and there's also a respiratory center in the pons, the pontine respiratory center. And it's not a real important one, but it still is a respiratory center in the pons. And so there are, which is of the brainstem, the tectal plate, the midbrain. Here's the pons here. These cerebral peduncles, the medulla oblongata down here. These pyramids is where motor tracts decussate in the medulla oblongata, and then there's mammillary bodies forming memories, and a thalamus up in here. So this is a diencephalon here. This is more than a brainstem. This is diencephalon up here, thalamus, pineal gland, and then right here down is the brainstem. So you need to know, remember, you need to know what parts are in the diencephalon, what parts and what things are in the brainstem. And here's a cross section of the brainstem. And you can see the tectum, the superior colliculi up here. This is cerebral aqueduct. This is this central gray matter right here, paraqueductal gray matter, which is pain, a nucleus for oculomotor nerves. Here's a substantia nigra right here, and here's the red nucleus right here. You go a little farther down, you got the inferior colliculus, the tegmentum in here. This is reticular formation. Decussation of nuclei, and a substantia nigra still. It's just a little farther inferior to the first cut here. And there's a cerebral peduncles, where the brainstem can speak to the cerebrum. Oh. And here we're going on a little bit farther, almost into the spinal cord. Here's these nuclei of the cell bodies of cranial nerves. Here's this medial lemniscus pathway. There are the pyramids, and there's the respiratory center, the ventral. We'll talk about this a lot more again next semester. In the respiratory system, we'll talk about the DRG and the VRG and the PRG, how they work together to set your breathing rate. Okay, and that's it for now. So I'm going to start in the cerebellum on the next lecture. So this is 203 brain 2. So I'll stop it here, and I'll catch you in the next lecture.